December 14th, 1940. London, England. The city was a ghost of its former self. Silent streets, stripped of the usual bustle, stood like remnants of a once thriving metropolis. Above, the dim hum of German bombers echoed, their presence only betrayed by the occasional flash of a distant explosion, the shockwave rippling through the smog-heavy air. The air raid sirens had become a twisted lullaby for the city's residents. They had learned to ignore them, to carry on as best as they could, trying to hold on to something that resembled normality. In the midst of this chaos, Margaret went about her business as usual. A milk delivery woman, though no one could have known the full extent of her true role. Her cart creaked as she pushed it down the narrow, war-ravaged streets, the clinking of the glass bottles accompanying each step. It wasn't much, this milk delivery. A humble service to the people of her neighborhood. But it was the perfect cover. Margaret's morning routine was as ordinary as they come, except it wasn't. With each bottle she placed on doorsteps, each small talk with a neighbor, she was conducting business of a different sort entirely. Her early hours weren't just spent delivering milk. They were spent passing messages, receiving codes, transporting documents from one hidden safe house to another, and all the while maintaining her cover as the simple, unassuming milk lady. No one suspected the woman in her worn woolen coat, her head tucked low against the biting cold, carrying nothing more suspicious than the jugs of fresh milk. In the tight, dim-lit alleys of London, there were no better eyes and ears than a milkman, or, in her case, a milkwoman. When the war began, it wasn't just soldiers who became key to the survival of the nation. It was ordinary civilians like Margaret who played silent, but crucial, roles in the effort against the Axis powers. It wasn't as though she volunteered for the work, though. In fact, it had come about almost by accident. A casual encounter on a cold winter morning in 1939 had set her on this path. She had been making her usual deliveries when a stranger, an older man with a thick accent, had caught her attention with an innocuous remark about the weather. At first, she had thought little of it, but in the following days, the man was there again, dropping small, cryptic hints as if testing her, as if seeing if she would bite. Margaret hadn't realized it at the time, but she had been drawn into something larger than herself, a world of secrets and dangerous liaisons, a network of people who believed that every small piece of information mattered. The strange man was a contact, a part of the burgeoning underground network of resistance fighters in the city. In a few short weeks, Margaret found herself handling messages that could cost lives if they fell into the wrong hands. The milk cart became her weapon, her unspoken alliance with the people who sought to fight back. The coded messages hidden beneath the bottles, folded into the edges of her newspaper or concealed in the lining of her coat. These were the tools of her trade. She had to be careful, always vigilant, because one mistake could expose the entire operation. There were moments when she had doubts. The fear that every trip might be her last weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had heard stories of others who had been caught. Innocent people who had been arrested, tortured, or worse, executed for crimes they didn't even understand. She wasn't just delivering milk. She was transporting secrets, dangerous secrets that could alter the course of the war. The paradox was clear. The very simplicity of her role, a milkwoman, had become the key to survival. But if the wrong person looked too closely, all could be lost. The resistance movement had become a game of shadows. Sometimes she would drop off the milk and receive a whispered phrase in return, like a password that unlocked an entire world. Sometimes it was only a fleeting glance, a subtle gesture that told her a message had been passed, and all she had to do was continue walking, as though she had seen nothing at all. One morning, she was making her way down a particularly quiet street when she saw a familiar face, the face of a young boy, standing at a doorstep. His gaze met hers briefly, and she noticed the subtle nod he gave her, as though expecting something. She had been given no explicit instruction, but it was clear. She approached him with her cart, carefully placing a bottle of milk onto the doorstep, and, as she did, she slipped a small envelope from her coat pocket into the hand of the boy. It was a brief moment, a silent exchange, but it held all the weight of the world in it. The boy's mother, a woman who had always given Margaret a warm smile, was inside the house. She had no idea that her son was part of the network. She had no idea that Margaret, the milk delivery woman, was helping to keep her family alive by aiding in the transmission of intelligence. But Margaret knew that everyone had their role to play, and hers was to move unnoticed, to blend into the fabric of daily life while carrying out an invisible war. As the months went on, the stakes grew higher. London, despite its resolute spirit, was crumbling. The German bombings were relentless, and the city's survival seemed more fragile by the day. But the underground network was thriving, with new connections, new faces, and new routes to deliver intelligence. For Margaret, it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something far greater, an unspoken duty to a cause larger than herself, a cause that had the power to change everything. Yet, for all her growing involvement, there were moments when she questioned everything. There were times when she wondered whether the risk was worth it, whether the quiet nights filled with secrecy and danger would ever be recognized, or whether, in the end, she would simply fade into history, her name lost in the annals of the forgotten. But Margaret couldn't stop. Every morning, she delivered milk. Every night, she delivered something much more precious. Each delivery was a lifeline in a city that was dying slowly, piece by piece, under the weight of a world war. And though the war would end one day, Margaret knew that when it did, her contribution would never be celebrated. She wasn't a hero with medals or a name engraved in history. She was just the milkwoman, the one who moved in the shadows, delivering not only milk but intelligence that could change the course of everything. Her story would remain untold, just as it had always been, until now. March 5th, 1941. The English Channel. The air was cold, biting, and carried the scent of salt water and impending danger. On the desolate beach, the waves rolled in slowly, their rhythm broken only by the occasional whistle of wind. The shoreline, once a symbol of serene beauty, had now become a silent witness to covert exchanges and hidden alliances. Here, under the cover of night, Margaret met a contact, her breath visible in the air as she stood shivering in her woolen coat. The tide was low, and the moonlight cast long, pale shadows across the sand. Her milk cart was gone. She had left it in a nearby alleyway, far from prying eyes. Now, as she approached the meeting spot, every sense heightened, she knew this was no ordinary delivery. This wasn't about milk anymore. This was a moment of life and death, a small cog in a much larger, more dangerous machine. The war had become a game of shadows, and Margaret had learned to play it well. The man who stood waiting for her on the beach was not someone she knew by name. Like so many others, he was part of a web of silent operatives who moved through the city like ghosts. She had met him only once before, in a darkened alley, when his face had been obscured by a hat and his voice muffled by the heavy fog. But she trusted him. The network was small, but its members shared a common cause. This man was one of the few who had access to the kinds of intelligence that could turn the tide of the war. "Everything ready?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as she walked closer to him. He nodded, glancing around the beach with the caution of someone who had lived through too many close calls. "You're late," he said softly, though not with accusation. Time, especially now, was something they could never afford to waste. Margaret's heart raced. Every step, every word, every action carried risk. The German spies were everywhere, listening in, watching. She had learned to be careful, to leave no trace, but tonight felt different. It wasn't just the danger, it was the weight of what she was carrying. It wasn't milk, wasn't even coded messages hidden in the folds of a letter. Tonight, she was delivering a piece of technology, a small, highly classified radio transmitter that would allow the resistance to communicate directly with their allies overseas. In the early days of the war, the Allies had relied on traditional methods of communication. But as the Axis forces gained ground, those methods became increasingly vulnerable. The Germans had cracked nearly every code, tapped every wire, and intercepted every transmission. To stay one step ahead, they needed something new, something that couldn't be easily detected. And so, a handful of brilliant minds in the resistance had devised a small, portable transmitter that could send encrypted messages from anywhere without leaving behind a trail. But the transmitter was incomplete, still being perfected, and Margaret's role was to transport it under the noses of the enemy. She didn't know all the details. She didn't need to. She only knew that this device could change everything. The war's outcome depended on people like her, the silent, forgotten players who risked everything for a future they might never see. As she handed the device to the man, her fingers lingered over the cold metal. It was heavier than it looked, and for a moment, she couldn't help but feel the weight of its significance. "What now?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly as she adjusted the straps of her coat. "Go back," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon again. "Don't stop. Don't even look over your shoulder." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. She had learned that hesitation could cost lives. The man turned and disappeared into the shadows, melting into the dark expanse of the beach, his footsteps muffled by the crashing waves. For a moment, she stood alone, the cold wind biting at her skin. She was just a woman, no different than any other. But in that fleeting moment, she felt the enormity of the role she had taken on. She wasn't just a messenger. She was a lifeline, an invisible thread in a network of resistance fighters who had dedicated their lives to fighting a war that seemed endless, hopeless even. As she began her return to the city, Margaret couldn't shake the unease that clung to her. The quiet of the beach had been deceptive. The real danger didn't lie in the shadows of the shoreline. It was in the streets of London, where the Germans had spies planted in every corner, every shop, every alley. She knew the rules. Don't make eye contact, don't linger, don't draw attention. The walk back felt longer, more oppressive. Her mind raced with thoughts of the device she had just delivered, the key to communicating with the outside world. She knew how vital it was, but she also knew how fragile the situation was. One wrong move, and the entire operation would collapse. As she neared the edge of the city, she saw the familiar streets of London beginning to take shape in the distance. The houses lined up like sentinels, quiet and shadowed. Each door, each window could hide an enemy. Margaret's every step was calculated. She couldn't afford to make a mistake now. If she did, if she was caught, the repercussions would be swift and brutal. Betrayal in wartime meant the end of everything. A lifetime of imprisonment, a bullet to the back of the head, or worse, her entire family held accountable for her actions. She walked faster, her pace quickening as the streets grew narrower, the houses more crowded. Every passing figure seemed a potential threat, every flicker of light from a window a beacon of danger. But as she walked, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the oppressive tension of being a courier in enemy territory. It was the sense that the game had changed. The spy network, once invisible, was now closing in on her, whether she was ready for it or not. When she finally reached her destination, a small, dimly lit safe house tucked away behind a row of houses, she exhaled deeply, the tension in her chest slowly easing. But it didn't last. The fear, the adrenaline, the knowledge that she was always one step away from being caught. This was her new reality. And though the mission had been completed, she knew that the hardest part had just begun. The city was waking up to a new, more dangerous reality. Margaret had done her part, but she could sense that the stakes were rising. There was no turning back now. The whispers of the resistance were growing louder, and so were the threats. Soon, even the shadows would no longer be enough to protect them. June 1st, 1945. London, England. The war was over. The streets of the city were teeming with life again, though it was a life that had been shaped by the horrors of years past. There was a sense of relief in the air, a collective exhale after the weight of fear and loss. The sound of church bells ringing echoed through the foggy streets, signaling the official end of a conflict that had claimed millions of lives, displaced thousands more, and forever altered the course of history. People spilled into the streets, cheering, celebrating, some crying with relief, others embracing long-lost loved ones. The city, though scarred, had survived. Margaret stood at the edge of it all, watching the crowds. She was among them, but she was apart from them. She had been a part of the war effort, yes, but not in the ways the world would ever acknowledge. She wasn't one of the soldiers who had fought in battle, nor was she a public figure whose name would be etched into the annals of history. She wasn't even a spy whose exploits would be recounted in books or films. No, Margaret was just a woman, one who had spent years delivering milk in the dark of night and passing along vital information that had helped change the course of the war. Yet, as the celebrations swirled around her, she felt a strange emptiness. She was one of many whose contribution had gone unrecognized, whose names would never be known. Her role, which had been so essential during the dark years, would fade into the shadows of history. It was as if the war had never truly seen her, had never truly understood what she had risked. To the rest of the world, she was still just a milkwoman. But to those who knew, she had been so much more. The day felt surreal. There was a jubilation in the air, but it rang hollow from Margaret. She had been on the front lines in her own way, pushing a cart of milk across a shattered city, using her seemingly mundane role as a cover for a far more dangerous one. She had delivered messages, carried secrets, and transported information that had been instrumental in the resistance efforts. She had been part of the invisible army that fought behind enemy lines, whose faces would never appear in any photograph or military report. The work she had done, the sacrifices she had made, the nights she had spent walking in constant fear of being caught, none of that would ever be celebrated. She glanced around at the people who were celebrating the end of the war, their faces full of joy and relief. She should have felt the same. She had done her part. The war was over, and now there was a future. Yet the future seemed distant, unreachable. She had delivered victory in her own quiet way, but it wasn't a victory that would be acknowledged, at least not publicly. It was a victory buried beneath layers of secrecy, a victory wrapped in the quiet anonymity of her life. In the days following the end of the war, there was a shift in the narrative. Heroes were celebrated, generals were lauded, and the public was fed stories of valor and sacrifice. But the unsung heroes, the ones who had been on the fringes, working in the shadows, were forgotten. Margaret wasn't the only one whose contributions went unnoticed. There were countless others like her, whose roles in the resistance had been critical, yet whose names would remain lost to time. The government began to sift through the rubble of the war, cataloging victories and losses, rebuilding what had been destroyed. They focused on the big picture, the public face of the war effort, the military campaigns, the famous spies, the high-ranking officials. The smaller stories, the ones that hadn't made headlines, were pushed aside. The woman who had spent years risking her life to pass information from one safe house to another was not mentioned in the history books. The letters she had carried, the messages that had helped shape military strategy, would never be tied to her name. The role of a milkwoman, no matter how essential, was not one that history cared to remember. Margaret found herself returning to the streets, to the same neighborhoods she had delivered to during the war. The buildings were still standing, the streets were still there, but everything felt different now. The city was moving on, and Margaret was a part of it, yet not a part of it. She walked the same paths, but they no longer held the same weight. The people she had delivered milk to, the family she had helped protect with her secret work, they went on with their lives, none of them aware of what Margaret had done to keep them safe. One afternoon, as she made her way through the familiar streets, she noticed a man standing in front of a house. He was old, his face lined with age and experience. He recognized her, though she hadn't seen him in years. His face lit up with recognition as he stepped forward.